Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be talking about something that's pretty relevant, I think, especially if you're prepping for the UPSC exam, specifically the International Relations section. We're going to be talking about nuclear disarmament.
Yeah, it's something that can feel very historical and also very relevant today. And the source we're working with here really digs deep into the complexities of a world without nuclear weapons.
So the million-dollar question is such a world possible? And even more so, like, should that be the goal? Even if we could just, like, snap our fingers and make all the nukes disappear?
Well, the source we're working with starts at the very beginning, at the birth of the atomic age, when Oppenheimer saw that first test and said those pretty intense words, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
Yeah, and it's no wonder that, I mean, from there we saw this huge wave of anti-nuclear movements. Like, the source goes into the history of all these groups. You've got the campaign for nuclear disarmament in the UK starting as early as like 1958, the European nuclear disarmament movement gaining a lot of traction in the 80s. I mean, did you know that in 1983, over 1 million people protested NATO's missile deployment in London?
Yeah, it's really something, isn't it? But these movements, they were more than just protests. They really wanted to create nuclear-free zones, which, by the way, now cover most of the Southern Hemisphere. They also pushed for international treaties like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. It was this effort on so many different levels to try and completely change the game.
And all this was going on at the same time as the Cold War, where the fear of nuclear war was just like this constant, undercurrent. It's kind of hard to imagine living with that level of tension. So what was driving these movements? Was it purely fear, or was there something, more going on?
I think fear definitely played a role, but at the heart of it was this really deep ethical argument against using nuclear weapons. They were asking this question, which is still relevant today. Can this devastating power, the power to wipe out cities indiscriminately, can that ever be morally justified?
That's a really hard question to answer. But, the source also brings up a completely different view, which is the realist perspective. It says that nuclear weapons are just another step up in the ladder of military escalation. And that viewpoint was definitely influenced by the Cold War logic of deterrence.
Yeah, exactly. A realist might even argue that nuclear weapons, as terrifying as they are, might have actually stopped some major wars from happening between the superpowers because the cost of the conflict would just be too high. It's a pretty chilling thought, but it's definitely a major theory in international relations.
So you have this moral push and pull happening on a global scale. And then we have Joseph Nye, who was this prominent scholar who really tried to find some middle ground between the ethical issues and the reality of nuclear deterrence. He came up with these 5 maxims of nuclear ethics to try and navigate this really complex issue.
And these maxims are something anyone studying international relations should really know about, especially if you're prepping for the UPSC. His first maxim states that the only reason to have nuclear weapons is for self-defense. But that brings up a whole other question. What exactly is self-defense when you've got all these shifting alliances and perceived threats?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's definitely not always black and white. Then you've got the second maxim, which says that nuclear weapons should never be seen as just another weapon, which really highlights how much potential for devastation they have and how careful we need to be.
And the third maxim gets into strategy, talking about how important it is to minimize any civilian casualties. It's bringing in ideas from just war theory about proportionality and not targeting civilians. But the question is that even possible with weapons as indiscriminate as nukes?
Man, these maxims really make you think. It's not just about having them or not having them. It's about how you think about them, even if you do have them.
Yeah.
Then the fourth maxim says that we need to focus on reducing the risk of war in the short term. That's where diplomacy and arms control and building trust come in.
And lastly, the fifth maxim focuses on the long game, trying to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons entirely. It's connected to ideas like Global Zero, which calls for a total shift in thinking about international security.
It seems like what Nye is trying to do is build a framework for ethical decisions within a system that feels, well, kind of amoral. But then the source moves on to a really fascinating chapter, President Obama's 2009 push for a world without nuclear weapons.
Yeah, Obama's speech in Prague was really ambitious. He was trying to change the way the world talked about nuclear weapons, working with Medvedev, who was the Russian president at the time, to make the NPT stronger.
And just for our listeners who are maybe newer to all this, the NPT is like the foundation of all these global efforts to stop nuclear weapons from spreading. It's a treaty that wants to limit who has them and to promote disarmament.
Exactly. Obama wanted to move past Cold War thinking and create a system where everyone worked together more on security. But the source points out this kind of obvious problem. Can the U.S., as the country with the most nuclear weapons, really be the one pushing for disarmament when they haven't even fully committed to the NPT themselves?
Right. And they still haven't signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which would stop all nuclear explosions. It's like telling everyone to quit smoking while you're still sneaking a cigarette every now and then.
Hmm.
So what happened when Obama shared this vision? Did everyone jump on board?
Not exactly. The source actually talks about three big obstacles that kind of got in Obama's way. First, you've got countries like Iran and North Korea. They just kept going with their nuclear ambitions, even with all that international pressure and sanctions.
Well, yeah, if you see the countries with the biggest stockpiles not disarming, why should you play by the rules? It kind of makes the whole thing seem less legit.
Exactly. And then on top of that, you've got to get all the major powers on the same page, which is way harder than it sounds. China's a good example. They've been getting more and more hesitant to make big cuts to their nuclear arsenal, especially with the U.S. still having such a big military presence in Asia.
So even with the best intentions, you can't ignore how the whole global power dynamic throws a wrench in things.
For sure. And then, that's not even all of it. There's the crazy technical challenges that come with actual disarmament. Like, how do you actually make sure a country destroyed all its weapons? How do you keep track of all that nuclear material so it doesn't fall into the wrong hands?
It's like, what, trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube, but on a global scale. So we've got these moral dilemmas, political roadblocks, and tech headaches. It's starting to feel like a nuclear-free world is just a pipe dream.
Well, hold on. Before we get too down on ourselves, the source throws in this other argument that's kind of a mind bender. It says disarmament could actually be dangerous.
Whoa. Okay, that's not what I was expecting. I thought getting rid of nukes is supposed to make things safer. How could it be dangerous?
The idea is that, as crazy as it sounds, maybe nuclear deterrence has actually been keeping things kind of stable between the big powers ever since World War II. The fear of total annihilation, mutually assured destruction, MAD, as they call it, it acted as a kind of safety net.
So you're saying if you take that fear away, countries might be more likely to get into conventional wars, which would obviously still be terrible, but wouldn't risk, the end of civilization as we know it.
It's a controversial idea, but it makes you think. And it gets even more complicated when you bring in this idea of the U.S. nuclear umbrella.
Hold on, rewind for a sec. For those of us who aren't, experts in international relations, what exactly is a nuclear umbrella?
Oh, right. Good point. Basically, it's like a security guarantee from a country that has nuclear weapons to its allies. So the idea is, if someone attacks an ally, the country with the nukes will retaliate with nuclear weapons.
So like a shield they're holding over those other countries.
Yeah, exactly. The U.S. has had this umbrella over places like Japan, South Korea, and its allies in NATO for decades. It's been a major part of how they think about staying safe.
But how does this connect back to disarmament being dangerous?
Well, if the U.S. really shrank its nuclear arsenal or even got rid of it completely, that umbrella would start to look less believable, right?
And then what? Those countries just hope that everyone will behave themselves.
I wish it was that easy. Some countries, especially those that feel threatened by neighbors who might be developing nukes, they're going to feel pretty vulnerable without that guarantee from the U.S.
So we might actually end up with more countries trying to get their own nuclear weapons, not less.
It's definitely possible, and it's something that leaders need to think hard about. It's a classic example of how things can backfire in international relations.
This is a lot to process. We started with this hopeful idea of a world without nukes, and now it seems like disarmament could create a whole new set of problems. For anyone listening who's getting ready for the UPSC, this back and forth is exactly the kind of nuanced thinking you need to be doing.
Couldn't agree more. It's not about just memorizing facts. It's about understanding how complex things are and being able to see all sides of the argument.
And for anyone who's just listening because they're interested, well, this is a perfect example of how those kind of abstract ideas in international relations actually play out in real life. We're not just talking theory here. This is about war and peace.
Exactly. What world leaders decide about nuclear weapons affects everyone's safety. It affects how stable different regions are. And at the end of the day, it affects people's lives.
So as we wrap up this part, let's take a moment to kind of take stock of things. What's standing out to you so far? What questions are you left with? Because the source doesn't end there. It actually leaves you, the listener, with a challenge, almost like a thought experiment. All right, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive into nuclear disarmament. And like we said, we saved the most thought-provoking part for last.
The source ends with this challenge. It asks you to imagine you're a world leader, thinking about everything we've talked about, the history, the ethical stuff, security concerns, all those crazy technical hurdles. What would your stance be on nuclear disarmament?
It's a question that really makes you think about the difference between what we want, ideally, and what's actually possible. Like, of course, everyone wants a world without these weapons that could destroy everything. But as we've seen, getting there is a lot more complicated than it sounds, and it might even be dangerous.
It definitely makes you think, right? It's not just some abstract debate anymore. You're the one making the decisions, and you have to weigh all these competing priorities. Would you try to get rid of all nuclear weapons, even knowing the risks we've talked about? Or would you be more cautious, focusing on making sure they don't spread and slowly reducing the number that are out there?
For anyone listening who's studying for the UPSC, this is where things get really interesting. You've got all these different viewpoints and arguments and what-ifs to consider, and now you have to put it all together, think critically, and come up with your own opinion.
Exactly. Memorizing facts is one thing, but what really matters is being able to think for yourself, see the big picture, and explain your own viewpoint.
And that's what we hope you've gotten out of this deep dive, a better understanding of how complicated nuclear disarmament is, the ability to see it from different angles, and the confidence to make your own conclusions.
And remember, there isn't one right answer. It's about engaging with these ideas, really wrestling with those tough questions, and coming up with your own informed viewpoint. That's what matters.
So before we wrap things up, we want to leave you with one last thought. We've talked a lot about the challenges and the risks and all the possible consequences, but we can't forget about the human cost of all this.
Right. Behind all the policy talk and strategic planning, there are real people whose lives are directly affected by these decisions. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, communities living near where they test these weapons, whole generations who've grown up knowing that these weapons exist.
Their stories are a reminder that this isn't just some intellectual exercise. This is about real people, real consequences, and the responsibility we all have to create a safer, more just world.
And that's everyone's responsibility, not just world leaders or politicians. It's about staying informed, asking the hard questions, holding our leaders accountable, and never forgetting that this is about people.
We hope this deep dive has given you the tools to do just that, to really engage with this important topic, think critically, and add your own voice to the conversation. Who knows, maybe someone listening right now will be the one who helps us move towards a brighter future.
It's a future worth fighting for, and I think knowledge, awareness, and taking action are how we get there.
And if you're finding these deep dives helpful, especially if you're preparing for the UPSC exam or just want to learn more about the world, don't forget to like and subscribe for more explorations of important global issues. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.